Needless to say, it's difficult to describe the main themes of any portion of Scripture that is as long and complex as Abraham's life. It's just not possible to mention every motif or theme that appears in these chapters, but it is possible to isolate several motifs that are more prominent than others. And as we'll see, these major themes in these chapters unify the stories of Abraham's life, and they help us understand the main ideas Moses wanted his original Israelite readers to draw from the life of Abraham. And more than this, we can also see in these main themes what God intends for us to learn from this part of Scripture. We'll look into the main themes of Abraham's life in two ways. First, we'll examine a key passage that introduces the four main themes of Abraham's life. And second, we'll explore the ways these themes are unfolded throughout the chapters of Abraham's life. Let's turn first to a key passage that introduces the themes of the story of Abraham. I'm sure you will recall that near the opening of the story of Abraham's life, we find God's call to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. While Abraham still lived in Ur of Mesopotamia, God called Abraham to go to the Promised Land. For many years now, interpreters have recognized that these verses introduce some of the most crucial motifs found in the larger story of Abraham's life. Listen to what Moses wrote in these verses. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." These three verses are packed with significance and can be summarized in many different ways. On a grammatical level, they begin with an introduction in the first portion of verse 1. Then they continue with God's words to Abraham, which divide into two parts. Part 1, in the second half of verse 1 through most of verse 2, consists of an imperative followed by three independent verbal expressions. Part 2 of what God said to Abraham appears in the last portion of verse 2 and in verse 3. This second half follows the same grammatical pattern as the first half. It's introduced by an imperative that's followed by three independent verbal expressions. By looking at these three divisions of Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, we can gain some important insights into the significance of this passage. Listen first to the simple way Moses introduced God's words to Abraham in verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram. A number of modern translations correctly observe that the verb in this line should be translated, the Lord had said, instead of simply, the Lord said. This translation is important because, according to Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7, verses 2 through 4, Abraham received his call in Ur before his father Terah died in Haran. But in the literary presentation of Genesis, we learn first that Terah died in chapter 11, verse 32, and then we learn in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, that God called Abraham. For this reason, Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 represents a flashback, a regression in time, and should be translated, the Lord had said. This verse recalls an earlier moment before Abraham had begun to do anything in response to God, long before he had begun to move toward the Promised Land. Following this introduction, we come upon the first half of God's words to Abraham. This first half begins with an imperative verb indicating a command. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, we read these words, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. As we can see, this section opens with the imperative, leave, or as the NIV paraphrases it, leave and go. God commanded Abraham to do something, to go to the land of Canaan. This is the first and primary command God gave to the patriarch. After the command to leave for the promised land, the first part of God's words to Abraham divides into 3 sections, indicated by 3 independent verbal expressions in the first part of verse 2. Look again at Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. These words focus on blessings that God presented to Abraham as he called him. First, God said he would make Abraham into a great nation. Second, he offered to bless Abraham with prosperity. And third, he said he would give Abraham and his descendants a great name or reputation. Now we come to the second half of God's words to Abraham. Although most modern translations do not enable us to see it, the second part of God's words to Abraham parallels the grammatical structure of the first half. It begins with an imperative, followed by 3 independent verbal expressions. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 through 3, we read these words, "And you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." The Hebrew verb translated here, "you will be a blessing," is imperative in form, and probably designed to parallel the form of the command, leave, in verse 1. But this imperative does not function as a command. It may be translated in a number of ways, such as, "and you will be a blessing," or "and may you be a blessing," or even, "and you will certainly be a blessing." In all events, this imperative marks an important transition in thought. It shifts attention away from Abraham receiving blessings, as we've seen in the first part of verse 2, to Abraham becoming a conduit of blessings to others. This second imperative form is also followed by 3 independent verbal expressions. These 3 verbs indicate the process by which Abraham would become a blessing to others. First, God said, "I will bless those who bless you." That is, God would give good things to those who dealt positively with Abraham. When people treated Abraham well, God would treat them well. Second, God promised, "Whoever curses you, I will curse." That is to say, God would curse those who disdained Abraham. God promised to protect Abraham from harm by responding harshly to those who made themselves Abraham's enemies. But in the third place, God said, "All peoples will be blessed through you." At first glance, this third focus may seem to contradict the theme of cursing for Abraham's enemies, but God promised Abraham that by means of a twofold process of blessing Abraham's friends and cursing his enemies, God would extend his blessings ultimately to all the families of the earth. So we see that the grammar of the opening of Genesis chapter 12 divides into 3 main parts: an introduction, a focus on blessings God would give to Abraham, and a focus on the blessings that God would bring to the whole world through Abraham. Understanding these verses in Genesis chapter 12 is important because in many respects, the stories of Abraham in Genesis illustrate how these promises God made to Abraham were fulfilled in his life. As Moses wrote about the patriarch, he shaped his stories in ways that drew attention to the words that God spoke to Abraham as he called him to the promised land. With this grammatical structure in mind, we're ready to see how the main themes of Abraham's life unfold from Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. We'll note that there are 4 major themes that appear in these verses. We'll begin with divine grace toward Abraham. Then we'll continue with the requirement of Abraham's loyalty to God. Then, God's blessings to Abraham. And finally, God's blessings through Abraham. The first motif, which occurs many times in the life of Abraham, is that God's relationship with Abraham was based on His grace. Divine grace appears in a subtle way in the introductory words of Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. As we've seen, there we read these words, "The Lord had said to Abram." These simple words reminded Moses' original audience that Abraham's relationship with God came about because God had entered into Abraham's life long before Abraham had done anything in service to God. Abraham's call came very early in his adult life. He had not left for Canaan. He had not conquered enemies. He had not committed to covenant faithfulness. He had not prayed for the righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah. He had not passed any test of faith. On the contrary, God called Abraham as His special servant simply because it pleased God to be gracious to Abraham. Now, of course, God's grace was not only shown in the initial stage of Abraham's walk with God. The grace of God is a theme that appears throughout the stories of Abraham, because God also showed mercy to the patriarch at every moment of his life. Because Abraham was a sinner, Abraham was in need of God's mercy all the time. For example, in the well-known verse of Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, we learn that even Abraham's saving righteousness was a gift of mercy. There we read these words, "Abraham believed the Lord, and He credited it to him as righteousness." As the Apostle Paul pointed out in Romans chapter 4, verse 3, and Galatians chapter 3, verse 6, the fact that God credited Abraham with righteousness indicated that this was an act of mercy, not a reward for good works. And it was through divine grace and mercy that Abraham received this and many other blessings from God. As Christians, we all know the importance of God's grace in our lives. We know that God initiates our relationship with Him by His grace, and we know that He sustains us in our relationship with Him by His grace. Where would we be without the mercy of God? Well, the same thing was true for Abraham. And more than this, God's grace was also essential for the lives of the Israelites for whom Moses wrote about Abraham. They too needed God's mercy in their lives, in their day, day after day. And for this reason, as Moses composed his stories of Abraham's life, he drew their attention over and over to God's grace. In addition to the theme of God's grace, we should also notice that Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 through verse 3 stresses Abraham's loyalty. God did not merely choose Abraham to receive His mercy. He showed mercy to the patriarch so that Abraham would respond with faithful obedience. As we have seen, the first imperative of Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 stresses Abraham's responsibility to be faithful to the Lord in a particular way. God commanded him there, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." It doesn't take much imagination to see that this divine call required enormous loyalty from Abraham. He was to leave his homeland and his father's estate behind and to go to a place yet to be shown him. Yes, God had shown mercy to Abraham, but Abraham was also expected to show deep-seated, loyal service to God. Unfortunately, many Christians tend to think of Abraham merely as an example of faith and trust in God. This is an important theme in Abraham's life, and it's highlighted in several New Testament passages. But we must never overlook the fact that God commanded Abraham to be obedient, to give him his loyal service. God required loyalty from the patriarch many times. He was to be faithful to God in every circumstance. Perhaps the most dramatic example of a time when Abraham was required to show his loyalty to God is found in Genesis chapter 22, the time when God commanded the patriarch to sacrifice his son Isaac to prove that he loved God more than he loved his son. It would be hard to imagine a higher requirement from God. Although Abraham was required to show faithfulness in this and many other ways, Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 makes clear one of the most important responsibilities Abraham had. There, God said, "Go to the land I will show you." As this passage demonstrates, Abraham was required to go to the land that God would show him. Abraham was to inhabit the land of promise, and this theme appears many times in the stories about the patriarch. It was very important to the larger plan of God, both for Abraham and his faithful descendants, that the patriarch go to the promised land. And when we recall that Moses wrote these stories about Abraham for Israelites whom he was himself leading toward the promised land, it's not surprising at all to see this emphasis. As followers of Christ, we understand that although salvation is a free gift of God's grace, God expects us to show our gratitude to Him by doing our best to obey His commands. Moses understood this principle as well. He knew that God's grace to Abraham led Abraham to be loyal to God. And for this reason, we're going to see that the requirement of loyalty appears many times as we study the life of Abraham. Moses knew something about his original Israelite audience. They were prone to forget the importance of faithful living before God. Although God had shown them much mercy as He delivered them from Egypt and sustained them in the wilderness, they turned from God's commandments. And for this reason, one of the main themes in the stories of Abraham was Abraham's loyalty to God. This theme appears so frequently because Moses' original audience, and we today as well, need to be motivated to serve God in faithful obedience. As we have seen so far, God showed much grace to Abraham and required faithful devotion from him. The third theme we should notice in Genesis chapter 12 verses 1 through 3 is the blessings offered to Abraham. You'll recall that God said this to the patriarch in Genesis chapter 12 verse 2. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great." God offered the patriarch three blessings. In the first place, God said that Abraham would become a great nation. His progeny would grow beyond number, and his descendants would actually become an empire, a grand nation. At that time, Abraham and those who were with him were relatively few in number, and Abraham had no children of his own. Yet God promised that the number of Abraham's descendants would one day be more than the stars in the sky. In the second place, God told Abraham that He would bless him. In all likelihood, this expression means that Abraham and his descendants would receive the blessing of tremendous prosperity. Abraham and his descendants would live in abundance and wealth. They would not be wanderers on the earth, nor would they be mere settlers. As Abraham and his children proved faithful, they would enjoy great prosperity. In the third place, God's offer of blessing entailed the bestowal of a great name on Abraham. In other words, if Abraham would go to the promised land and serve God faithfully, the massive numbers and prosperity of his descendants would make him and them honored throughout the world. Great glory would come to the patriarch and his faithful descendants. In fact, throughout the stories of Abraham, Moses pointed out over and over that these kinds of blessings were poured out on Abraham. Abraham had sons, He gained wealth as he went from one experience to another. He became a well-known figure in the region. For the Israelites who heard these stories, Abraham's blessings brought great hope for their future blessings as well. The gift of descendants, prosperity, and fame given to the patriarch were mere foreshadows of even greater gifts that God would give to Abraham's faithful descendants. As Christians, we have received so many blessings from God that we can hardly name them all. And of course, the Israelites who followed Moses toward the Promised Land had also received countless blessings from God. They had been delivered from slavery. They had increased in number. They had been protected and sustained throughout their entire journey, and they were on their way to the land of promise, a land of great blessing in the future. But the Israelites were like us. They were prone to forget all that God had done for them and what was in store for them. So Moses wrote about God's blessings to Abraham to remind his Israelite audience of the blessings that God had given them in their lives so that their hearts would be filled with gratitude. In addition to God's mercy, Abraham's loyalty, and God's blessings to Abraham, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 also draws attention to the fact that blessings would come through Abraham to other peoples. Remember what God said in Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. "And you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." These words explained that Abraham would not only receive blessings, but that all peoples on earth will be blessed through him. God did not call Abraham to the Promised Land simply to enrich his life and the lives of his descendants. God called Abraham to be a conduit of divine blessings to all the families of the earth. Now, it's important to remember that this passage teaches that Abraham's worldwide blessing would come about in two ways. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, God said, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse." According to this passage, Abraham would serve as a double-edged sword among human beings. Because Abraham was favored by God, when people from other nations blessed Abraham, that is, when they honored him and thus honored the God whom he served, then God would bless them. But when people of other nations cursed or attacked Abraham and thus disdained Abraham's God, God would punish them. The fates of other people depended on how they treated Abraham. In his lifetime, Abraham came into contact with many people representing other nations, such as the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Egyptians, his nephew Lot, who was the father of the Moabites and the Ammonites. These interactions were significant because they showed specific ways in which God kept his word to bless and curse other peoples, depending on how they treated Abraham. They also indicated that even in his own lifetime, Abraham had begun to become a blessing to the world. All too often, it's easy for God's people to forget this important teaching. The Israelites in Moses' day were like many Christians living today. We enjoy the blessing of salvation from God and life from God, but we forget why these blessings have been given to each of us. Each and every blessing God gave to Israel under Moses' leadership, and each and every blessing he gives to his church today, is designed for a greater purpose. We have been blessed so that we will spread the blessings of God throughout the world. God called Abraham to himself so that Abraham would lead the nations of the world into God's blessings. God called Israel to himself in Moses' day so that they would lead the nations of the world into God's blessings. And God has called the church to himself today so that we may lead the nations of the world into the blessings of God. This theme was so important for the Israelites who first received the stories of Abraham, and it is important for us too as we follow Christ in our day. In this lesson, we've taken our first look at an overview of the life of Abraham. And we focused our attention on the structure or design of this portion of Genesis. And we've also examined the main themes or content that Moses presented in Abraham's life in the context of this literary structure. As we move forward in these lessons, we'll return to the topics of this lesson time and again. We've seen that the story of Abraham's life has a 5-step symmetry, and we've also seen that there are 4 main themes in Abraham's life: God's benevolence to Abraham, Abraham's loyalty, the blessings of God to Abraham, and the blessings of God through Abraham. These themes not only give us insights into what the story of Abraham's life meant long ago when it was first written for Israel, but they also make it possible for us to apply this portion of Scripture to our lives today.